Dale Carpenter, you've written a fine book on the Supreme Court case of Lawrence versus Texas, sort of book that sort of tells the story from the beginning to the end. Let me begin with sort of a big picture question at the end. Why was the Lawrence case important?
I would say this is probably one of the most important civil rights decisions or constitutional law individual liberty decisions from the Supreme Court over the past 50 years or so. And it's the most important decision so far for the rights of gay men and lesbians. So this is an opinion that is important to a great many people, and I think will be long remembered in American constitutional history.
And tell me why. I mean, in other words, there was one sort of law that was in effect prior to Lawrence, and Lawrence changed the law in a big way. But tell me a little bit about heading into the Lawrence case, where the law was before and where it was after.
Well, in a series of cases and laws around the country, the states had banned so-called sodomy, which included certain specified sexual acts over many, many years. But Texas had decriminalized much of the old archaic sex offenses and had solely focused on gay sex and criminalized gay sex. These laws came before the courts, both state courts and federal courts over the years, ending with a resounding defeat for gay civil rights advocates in a Supreme Court decision called Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986. And that decision had declared that any, what the court called, right to homosexual sodomy was at best facetious, that there was no fundamental right to such a thing, that there was no right of privacy that extended to protect gay people and their intimacy even in their own homes and even as adults. And there the law stood, the constitutional law stood until Lawrence versus Texas came along in 2003 and changed that. There was a development happening, though, at the same time, which is that the states one by one were either repealing legislatively or having overturned through judicial action their own state sodomy laws. So we went from a situation in 1960 where all 50 states had some kind of sodomy law, which applied to both heterosexual and gay sexual activity, to, by 1986, about half the states still having such laws, to 2003, when Lawrence is decided, and we still had 13 states with such laws. So they were very much on their way out, but the constitutional doctrine upholding them still stood, and states like Texas were resisting repealing their laws, and their courts would not overturn them until someone was actually arrested in the home for allegedly having sex in violation of these laws.
And you write, and I think very effectively, that it wasn't during those years that the police were in large numbers aggressively going out and arresting people, but that as long as those laws were on the books, gays and lesbians were sort of branded as criminals under the law. And that I take it that some of the biggest impact of the laws was on things like custody questions, adoptions, jobs, employment. In a whole lot of states, you could be sort of branded as a criminal as long as those laws were on the books.
That's right. The laws were only rarely enforced. In fact, we have very few known verifiable instances of enforcement of sodomy laws against private activity between adults, where no minor is involved, where no quasi-public place is involved. Very few examples of enforcement like that. They did exist, but they were few and far between. The laws were used instead as a justification or as a pretext for discriminating against gay men and lesbians in every area of life. And in fact, the Bowers versus Hardwick decision itself from 1986 was cited by federal courts and state courts across the country as a reason not to provide any additional judicial protection to gays and lesbians from discrimination. Police departments like the Dallas Police Department banned the hiring of homosexuals on the grounds that these were people who were identified as a criminal class and therefore should not be entrusted with enforcing the law. Gay people could be and were banned from being teachers in public schools on the grounds that they were modeling criminal behavior for students. Gay parents lost custody of their children or had their visitation rights restricted. Anti-discrimination laws of all kinds were resisted on the grounds that we should not model or protect what is essentially a criminal class of people. In every area of life, the sodomy laws were not so much enforced against sex, but were enforced, in fact, in other ways.
That's what I thought was so unusual about this area of law, that the laws were not actually enforced, but they had a powerful impact as long as they were on the books. And then, lo and behold, the laws were enforced in September of 1998 when the police went out to arrest two men in an apartment in Houston for what appears to be a false report. A false report at several levels. Tell us how the case actually got underway then.
Well, that day, September 17th, 1998, which happens to be Constitution Day in the United States, these three friends, John Lawrence, Tyron Garner, and Robert Eubanks, were moving some furniture around. They had finished their work for the day and decided to go out to a restaurant where they had a few drinks, came back to John Lawrence's apartment where they continued to do some drinking and watching television and so forth. Eubanks and Tyron Garner, one of the two defendants in the Lawrence versus Texas decision, who was himself black while Robert Eubanks was white. Eubanks and Garner got into a kind of a fight orally, perhaps involving some jealousy, and Eubanks announced at one point in the evening that he was going to go get a Coke out of a vending machine, which was down on the first floor of the apartment building in which John Lawrence lived. So he gets up from an easy chair in the living room, puts down the bottle of vodka that he had been drinking from, goes over to a drawer in the kitchen, gets some change out, and then leaves the apartment to go downstairs. But instead of getting a Coke, he in fact put that money into a payphone. And he called the Harris County Sheriff's Office, which was the police department in charge of that area in which John Lawrence lived. And he reported to the sheriff's office that there was a black man, referring to his partner, Tyron Garner, going crazy with a gun inside of John Lawrence's apartment. So at that moment, there was John Lawrence and Tyron Garner still back in the apartment and possibly another man. And Robert Eubanks is down on the first floor making this call to the sheriff's department. That was, of course, a false report, and he was later charged with filing a false report and spent a couple of weeks in jail. It's a quite serious offense. Once that report was made, that it becomes a very high priority call for the sheriff's office, as it would for any law enforcement agency. It's a potentially dangerous situation for citizens. It's a potentially dangerous situation for any law enforcement authorities. So a few sheriff's deputies who were patrolling in the area immediately turned around their cars and headed into the apartment complex looking for this apartment and this black man who was supposedly going crazy in a weapons disturbance. The first to arrive on the scene encountered Robert Eubanks at the base of the stairs to John Lawrence's apartment and asked him, "Where is the man with the gun?" And he pointed up to the second floor at the top of some stairs where there was a landing toward John Lawrence's apartment. He was quickly joined by three other deputies from the sheriff's department, and they decided to go up together. And at that point, they go up the stairs in what's called a tactical stack, one behind the other, with their guns drawn, ready to deal with any weapons disturbance that they might find. They arrive at the top of the landing, and at that point they knock on the door. They say at that point, this is where the stories diverge, by the way, between the John Lawrence and Tyron Garner on the one hand and the police on the other. But they say they knocked on the door, and that had the effect of opening it up. They looked inside the apartment, according to them, and they There was a light on inside of a living room. It's a small 2-bedroom apartment.
And they presumably said police?